Welcome back. This is the 9th program in our accelerated NLP training series. As we continue now through our interventions, we're going to move on to anchoring. Why don't you turn to page 46 in your manual. So what is anchoring anyway? What is anchoring? Well, it's a process of stimulus response, and the first person to notice anchoring was a guy named William Twittmeyer. If you've heard of him. It was Bill Twittmeyer who first, I think it was 1902, realized that when he was a medical doctor, and he would hit a patient on the knee with that little hammer, that they have. Well, he'd hit a patient on the knee, and he noticed that their knee jerked. And so in 1902, he wrote a paper about the knee-jerk reflex, which he presented to the American Medical Association. Now, the thing that he also did was he noticed also that if he told the patient that he was going to hit their knee and then hit their knee, and he did it several times, he also noticed that sometimes when he told the patient he was going to hit their knee, before he could hit their knee would jerk. Sounds like an anchor to me. Anyway, he wrote the paper called Knee-Jerk Reflex, presented it in 1902, and I don't think it went very far. I don't think it, a lot of people in the AMA were real interested, except for the hammer thing and the knee jerk. But the notion of anchoring didn't get picked up, except I think a young Russian researcher named Ivan Pavlov read it, and in 1904 he presented his paper to the Russian Medical Society called Stimulus Response. And by 1904 he'd been doing work with dogs, woof, and he's barking, oh no. He was doing work with dogs and doing anchoring and doing stimulus response tests. Actually, what Pavlov would do is he'd take a dog and he'd show the dog a steak and ring a bell, or actually it was a tuning fork. And he'd ring a bell and show the dog a steak. And he got those two things, the stimulus, the steak and ringing a bell or the tuning fork, at the same time. And then eventually he noticed that when he rang the bell, the dogs would salivate without the steak being present. And so he wrote his paper in 1904, and that eventually became behavioral psychology. Actually, in 1936, Andrew Salter wrote a really nice book called Conditioned Reflexes, and that's really a lot of the work in behavioral psych. It came originally from Pavlov. The interesting thing, however, is that we in NLP picked up on the idea of anchoring and began to notice that people are also subject to anchoring too. I'm not calling you a dog necessarily, but people are subject to anchoring. How many, I often ask this question, how many people in a classroom, how many people were subject to an anchor today? And I have people raise their hands, and of course, the fact is that everyone probably was. For example, how many anchors are there? Your alarm clock in the morning, you're driving along in the car and there's a stoplight, certain advertising slogans. In fact, I can't even say in a class, even today, and this was 20 or 30 years ago, I can't even say in a class today, Winston tastes good like a, and people will fill it in. So those are all anchors. Oh, the phone. The other one is the phone. The phone rings. Do you get up to get it? You bet. Sometimes I'm up to get the phone even before I think about it. So these are all anchors, and behavioral psychologists believe that our behavior is the result of anchors. Our behavior is actually a series of anchors that is a series of conditioned reflex. And they believe that we're simply a conditioned reflex machine. And that the learning of new things is simply a matter of setting up new anchors and connecting new things with those anchors. Now, a swish pattern that we've learned is an example of doing a visual anchor. Now, some people in NLP believe that NLP is actually only anchoring and reframing. Some people believe that anchoring is one of the major parts of NLP, and I would say it plays a pretty good part in it. So we're going to talk about anchoring today, and we'll look at page 46. Now, what is the definition of an anchor? Let's go back and define it a little bit. Anytime a person is in an associated intense state, if we apply at the peak of that experience a specific stimulus, then the two get linked together neurologically. And anchoring can assist you in gaining access to past states and linking the past state to the present and to the future. Now that's useful. For example, let's say that you wanted to be more in control of your state. If you had a really powerful resource anchor, which would be all of the times when you ever felt real positive about yourself, stacked together, that is put together into one big anchor, then probably that would help you at any time when you felt a little low or you felt like your resources weren't totally present. If you just sort of fired off that anchor, then that probably would put you in a really powerful positive state. And of course, the answer is it would. So anchoring, see, here's the question. I think the question you may want to ask yourself is, how would I like to be totally in charge of my own internal state? For me, that was a major shift in my experience, because I'll tell you what, before NLP, I used to wake up in the morning and I used to think that my state was controlled by the way I woke up. So some mornings I would wake up and I'd feel really good. And, you know, and I would go, whoa, I feel great. And I'd go through the whole day and I'd have a great day. And yet, some mornings I would wake up and I'd feel really awful. I might have a negative state, or I might feel really tired or whatever. And I noticed that those days that I felt really awful, especially in the early days when I was in selling radio advertising, I noticed that I would actually have to just take some time for myself. Well, what I realized after NLP was that I was in control of my own state, and that I could be totally in charge of my own state. That was real powerful for me, because what I realized was I could be at any moment in the kind of state that I chose to be. So if I needed to be in a powerful, positive state, I could be. If I needed to be in any state that I needed, I could literally call it up in the moment. Well, how do you do that, Tad? How do you do, you might ask, how do you do that, Tad? Well, the way you do that is to simply pay attention to the internal representations that you make. Let's briefly for a moment jump back and look at page 7. Let's go back and look at page 7. And remember now that there's an external event, but that external event could also be simply thoughts that you have inside your head, or it could be memories that get triggered inside your head. So we have an external event, but it could be some communication from inside yourself or outside yourself, which end up inside yourself as an internal representation. And that internal representation is intimately coupled to a state, and that state is intimately coupled to a physiology. Now, anchoring takes place right here on the left-hand side of the diagram on page 7, in that package of the internal representation, which you'll remember is made up of pictures, sounds, feelings, tastes and smells, and your self-talk. And that's intimately coupled to a state, which is a happy state, a sad state, a motivated state, and so forth. And that's intimately coupled to the physiology. So the relationship between the internal representation and the physiology ends up being the state. And the state is what we anchor in anchoring. The state, whatever state it is that you're in, is what we end up anchoring when we do anchoring. Of course, that entire package of internal representation, state, and physiology ends up creating our behavior. So we're most interested in being able to be in charge of that internal representation or that state, and or the physiology altogether. So now let's talk for a moment about how to be in charge of your own internal state. We can go back to page 46 here for just a moment. We're going to jump to another page in a moment. But let's go back to page 46. How do we be in charge of our own internal state? Well, I think this is really important from the point of view of state control. I think that people are more in charge of our state or their state than we give them credit for. And so I think that one of the presuppositions of NLP, and it came out as the question of who's driving the bus, really, who's in charge of that vehicle that you have inside your head, or the vehicle that you use as you go through your daily activity, who's actually in charge of that particular transportation vehicle. And of course, that would be you. Now, you're in charge of your thinking. You're the person in charge of what you do. You're the person who creates the thoughts you have. You're the person who can choose to think a thought or not to or choose not to think a thought. Now, if you want to be in a really positive state, all you have to do is remember a time when you were in that positive state. Here's an example. Can you remember a time when you were totally motivated? If you would, why don't you just stop for a moment and go back into the past and remember a time when you were totally motivated. Please remember a specific time. And as you go back to that time now, what I'd like you to do is go back to that time and float down into your body, right into your body. There you go. And see what you saw, hear what you heard, and feel the feelings of being totally motivated, and feel the energy as it goes through your body, feeling totally motivated. There you go. Good. Now, that is an example of being in charge of your state. Okay, come on back. So you could, at any moment, choose to be totally motivated, or you could choose whatever state you're in. Now, the interesting thing is you're in charge of your brain. You're the one who's running the brain. You're the one who's driving the bus, so to speak. So you really do have the choice by simply paying attention to the internal representations that you use, the internal representations that you have inside of your head. Now, people have internal representations throughout the entire day. In fact, everyone has a series of internal representations that go through their head on a regular basis. How do we capture those? Here's the question. How do we capture those internal representations and link them so that they're hooked up to a stimulus or to an anchor so that we can recall that state at will? Well, that's the process of anchoring. Now let's jump over and look at page 26, because this also brings into account the notion of triggers. And remember, we talked about triggers, the way you pick up the front end of a like to dislike, as you say, when you think of that, you have a picture. We talked about a swish pattern. And whenever you're setting up a swish pattern, you need to ask the person, how do you know it's time to? Now with an anchor, we're back to page 26. With an anchor, we're going to ask the person, can you remember a time when you were totally X'd, or whatever that state is? Can you remember a specific time? So we're going to ask the person to remember a specific time when they accessed a certain state. And that state is really important. We're going to catch that state. We're going to watch the person as they go into the state, and we're going to catch the state as they go into it. So let's see what the steps are to anchoring, and there's 4 steps to anchoring. Now we've given you, as in the Milton Model, we've given you a mnemonic device to make it easier for you to remember these. You don't need to remember them necessarily as a practitioner, but certainly by the time you want to become a trainer, it'll be important for you to be able to remember the 4 steps to anchoring. So the first step is to have a person that you're working with recall a past vivid experience. The first thing is to have the person recall a past vivid experience. Now, the experience itself should be, I would say, really vivid. That means, what does that mean? It means that you want to have them be associated in the event. The event wants to be quite intense. So if you say to a person, can you remember a time when you were totally motivated? And they go like this, yeah, I guess so. Then that's not real motivated. So you should be asking the client to access a state, and they should be accessing it more like this. Can you remember a time when you were totally motivated? And the person goes, yes. That's a motivated state. You can tell that's a motivated state. You can see that as you look at them, you can see the shift. And what do you see the shift in? You see the shift in the skin color and the skin tonus. You see the shift in the breathing rate and location, the pupil dilation and focus, and the breathing. All of that, you see the entire shift in the person using your sensory acuity, and you notice that the person goes into a state. Now, the person actually recalls a past vivid experience. Now, something that's really intense is probably the most important way to remember it. Actually, there's 3 levels of a past vivid experience. So let's talk about those. Let me sort of break that down for you. The most intense experiences, of course, are naturally occurring experiences. So if we can actually catch the client experiencing a state in the moment. So if we were with, say, this person and they were remembering a time when they were totally motivated, that's going to be less intense than actually being in the state in the time when they were totally motivated. If we're with them, of course, we're not with our clients all the time, fortunately. So they're going to have to use a recalled situation. But if you're with someone, or you yourself are anchoring yourself and anchoring a state, if you're in a state in the moment, that's really a good time to perform the anchor. So the most vivid states are usually naturally occurring states. The next most vivid states are states which are recalled, and those want to be really associated. And the next one, which is also possible to anchor but least preferable, are states which are constructed. Now, some people can't really recall past powerful positive states, so then we ask them to construct the state. And we might say something like this. Can you remember a time when you were totally motivated? And the client would go, I really have trouble remembering a certain state. So then you can say to the client, well, okay, so how about this? How would you stand if you were totally motivated? Stand up and show me if you were in a situation where you were totally motivated today, right now, how would you stand? How would you be standing? So stand like you'd be standing and breathe like you'd be breathing and say to yourself those things that you would say to yourself as you do that in that way. And so what the person's going to do is they're going to construct a constructed state for you. Now, that's the least vivid of the three, the least preferable, but it is acceptable because some people can actually be anchored in that way. All right. So we're gonna recall a past vivid experience. And by the way, the state elicitation script is on page 47. If you looked ahead, you probably already noticed that. So the next thing is we're going to provide an anchor. We're going to anchor at the specific stimulus at the peak. But let me explain to you what I mean by at the peak here. It says at the peak, that's the standard NLP line. But I want to talk to you for a moment about precision anchoring. This is really, really important. Let's, at the bottom of page 46, we have a sort of a chart of an anchor and also of a state. So what we have here is at the bottom, we have the intensity, and the intensity rises, and then the time goes from left to right. So you'll notice that this state is coming up here. It begins at the very beginning, and you see it beginning to rise up. I'm going to assume that even with your fabulous sensory acuity, because I know that you've been practicing this since you heard a few programs ago all about sensory acuity. I know you've been practicing sensory acuity, but I'm going to assume, because I also don't pick it up right away, I'm going to assume that you aren't going to see it right away when the person begins to go into the state. Now, the truth is that some people go into a state very rapidly. So you say to them, can you remember a time when you're totally motivated? And they go, yes, right away. Okay. Now, there are also some people who go into a state very, very slowly. So you say, can you remember a time when you're totally motivated? And they sit there and they think, and then they go, yes. And so in between that, they've had a few moments to access the state. You need to look at the person, look across at them, and notice what the shift is in color, skin tonus, lower lip size, pupil focus and dilation, and so forth. All of those things that we look at with our sensory acuity. You need to look across at them and notice, and then provide that anchor right at the peak. Now, how do we anchor it at the peak? Let's watch. See the left-hand side of the diagram from the beginning at the very bottom, right up to where the anchor begins. I'm going to assume, for purposes of this discussion, that we didn't notice them going into the state until it got to right there. The minute and you might want to make a note right here on your notes on page 46. The minute you notice the client going into the state, the minute you notice, or the second you notice, I guess I would say, the second you notice the client going into the state, what I want you to do is get your hand on that anchor. Now, if you look at the slide section and look at page 15, there's actually a picture of an anchor being applied to a knuckle. I like the knuckles for applying an anchor because they're really, really, they don't change. They really, really stay where they are. One time I anchored a fellow on his shirt, and I was calibrating on the seam of the shirt. And it was really funny because as I calibrated on the seam of the shirt, he stood up and shifted his shirt around. And I went, oh no, there's my whole calibration. Well, the nice thing about the knuckles is they don't move. Take a look at your hand for a moment and bend the knuckles back and forth and then shake your hand all around. And notice the knuckles pretty much tend to stay in the same place. That's the good thing about the knuckles. I like them because they're always there. So we're going to apply the anchor to a place which is easy to get at. The knuckles are nice because, like I said, they stay up in the same place. And you may want to ask the client, I'm going to touch you in a moment. Would that be okay? All right, so we've applied the anchor. We've noticed the person going into state here. We're looking at our chart on the bottom of page 46 on the diagram there. We've noticed the person going into the state. We've noticed the intensity of the state coming up, 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 up. And then the minute you notice it, you're going to get your hand on the anchor. And now when do you get the hand off the anchor? Please make a note also on page 46, right at the end where you notice the anchor ends. Right there is the peak of the state. So actually, when you provide a specific stimulus, you're going to provide the specific stimulus just before the peak so that the hand comes off when the state reaches the peak. You do want to take your hand off when the state reaches the peak because sometimes other states come in afterward. We don't want to pick up those other states because a lot of times there's other things mixed in. So typically when we do an anchor, we're going to put the hand on the minute we notice the anchor beginning, and we're going to pull the hand off the minute we notice the state hits its peak. Now, here's the truth. The truth is you won't actually notice the state hit its peak when it hits its peak because you're simply going to be able to calibrate on the difference. So you're going to have to wait for a few seconds until the state begins to go down to where you know there's the peak. So you actually are going to pick it up and take your hand off slightly after the end of the peak. Now that's a real technical discussion of that. Typically, if you just simply get on just before the peak and get off right at the peak, that'll be great. Okay, we've anchored the state. Now we're going to change the person's state. And then we're going to evoke the state again by setting off the anchor to test it. So we recall a specific state, we anchor the state, then we change the state, then we evoke the state and make sure that we've tested the state and make sure it can be recalled. Now, what are the keys to anchoring? We've talked a little bit about some of these things, and so let's get real specific here. There are 5 keys to anchoring, and we've given you a mnemonic device, which is I turn. There are 5 keys to anchoring. What are they? Well, first of all, the intensity of the experience is real important. We talked a little bit about that. An anchor is a stimulus which is recalled and which is applied to a state when a person is recalled a very powerful positive or powerful negative state. If you're anchoring the state, remember the person needs to be fully associated. Then at the peak of the experience, or just before the peak, you apply that stimulus, and when that happens, the two get linked together, and they're linked together neurologically. The next thing, of course, is the timing of the anchor. We just talked about that. People go into the state, you pick it up just as it begins, and then just before it hits, or when it hits its peak, or maybe even slightly thereafter, you get your hand off. You can see it, you'll be able to see it because you've got great sensory acuity. You'll notice the skin color change, the skin tonus, the focus of the eyes, the breathing, the rate and location, and so forth. Then the third thing is the uniqueness of the stimulus. If you anchored somebody by shaking their hand, is that a unique stimulus? No, probably not. In fact, every time someone went to shake their hand, that person might go into that same state. But then after a while, the state would get watered down, especially if there were other states going on at the same time. So if anchors are in a unique location, they'll literally last forever in the right circumstances. If the anchor is applied forever, it'll take the first time and it can be recalled forever. However, if it's in a place where it continues to get fired off or gets watered down or gets weakened, then it won't last forever. It may not be. So if the anchor is applied correctly, however, it'll take the first time and you'll be able to recall the state forever. Now, one thing you can do is you can stack an anchor. You can stack it, and we'll talk about that as we go. As the anchor gets stacked, or as more and more states are stacked in the same place, then the anchor will get more powerful and be able to elicit the certain state. Okay, the next is the replication of the stimulus. And the replication of the stimulus is being able to repeat it. So that essentially means that we can actually take the state, we can fire off the anchor again, and it will repeat the number of state, or repeat the state. And then number 5 is the number of times. The number of times. How many times do we actually stack that anchor? So the number of times actually relates to stacking. And what it means is the more times you put the same state in the same place, the more powerful the anchor will become. Okay, so we've talked about anchoring. Now let's talk about elicitation of states a little bit. And anchoring, by the way, is so marvelous because it really allows you to be in control of your own state. So let's see what we've got here. Page 47. The best states to anchor are naturally occurring states, as we said. The next best are past, vivid, highly associated states. And the least preferable are constructed states. You need to calibrate the person when they go into the state, and here's what you say. Can you remember a time when you were totally, whatever the emotion is, totally X'd? Can you remember a specific time? As you go back to that time now, go right back to that time, float down into your body, and see what you saw, hear what you heard, and really feel the feelings of being totally X'd. So what kind of states are useful to anchor? Well, let's look and see. I think if you want to stack an anchor, you elicit several instances of states and you anchor them in the same place. The state that you choose for a particular stacked anchor can be the same or it can be different. In a resource anchor and in a collapse anchors, the states used in a single anchor are different. And in chaining states, the states used for each stacked anchor should be the same. We'll talk about each of those separately when we get to that. All right, so first of all, these are some states that you could use. And I kind of like these. These are by no means the only states. If your client or you, if you like other states, then by all means use those. Let's see, a time when you felt totally powerful, a time when you felt totally loved, a time when you felt you could have it all, a time when you knew that you could have it all. How about a time when you were really energetic, a time when you had a ton of energy? And then my favorite, how about a time when you fell down laughing? I think that's a great state. And then a time when you felt totally confident, totally capable. Now, as you elicit the states, here's the secret. This is how to make it work. When you elicit the state, you as the practitioner, being in rapport with your client, so you're going to be in rapport with your client, you as the practitioner are going to go into the state that you're eliciting. So notice this. Here we go. So you say to the client, you go like this. If you say to the client, "Oh, can you remember a time when you fell down laughing?" That's not going to be real powerful for the client. It's not real associated on your part. But now let's say that you're in rapport with the client. So you've got rapport with the client, and then you say to the client, "Can you remember a time when you fell down laughing?" Now, if the client and you are in rapport, your state will carry the client into that state. Isn't that great? So you will actually carry the client right into the state, and both you and the client will go right into the state as you do it. So that's kind of nice. Okay, so that's our state elicitation script. We're going to use that each time we elicit a state. Let's jump over now to page 48, and I want to talk about collapse anchors. Let's talk about the process of collapsing anchors. You and I can do an exercise before we get done. I think we'll do together. We'll do Circle of Excellence, which is kind of fun, and that's later on in this segment. But let's look at collapse anchors here on page 48. Now, collapse anchors takes and gives a person a whole new set of neurological choices. It's best used when a person goes into a state that they're not particularly comfortable with and they wish they didn't. Actually, it's most useful when the person goes into a negative state which they wish they didn't go to in the present time or in the current moment. It can also be used for phobias and other interventions. I've actually done a collapse anchor on a phobia and had it disappear. But that may not always happen. Certainly, setting up a real powerful positive restore state would be really good when you're working with a phobia. But the collapse anchors is not used for a belief change. The best way to do a belief change in NLP is to use the submodalities change, which we've already talked about. The best way to do a collapse anchors, however, the best states for collapse anchors are simply negative states which the client wishes they didn't get into. Now, on the other hand, the issue comes up then, well, what state specifically? I mean, would you use this to collapse anger or fear? And the truth is, for the major negative states, I probably would use timeline therapy. We'll talk a little bit about timeline therapy as we get nearer to the end of this series. But just remember that when you do collapse anchors, I'd probably use it for minor states that the client wanted to get rid of. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is set up a really powerful positive resource anchor. And in that sense, what we're going to do is we're going to stack a bunch of different states in the same place. So remember a time when you were, totally motivated. Can you remember a time when you fell down laughing? All of the states on page 47 and any other state that your client likes or that you like or that you'd like to add there. Then, and we stack those up, then we're going to stack or put in a separate place and not stack the negative state. Now remember, here's the thing about collapsing anchors. If the positive states are greater in intensity than the negative states, then the negative states will win out. If, on the other hand, the negative state actually is greater than the positive states, then sometimes the negative state could overtake the positive states and you'd lose those. So this is really where your calibration comes into play. You really need to pay attention to the client and notice if the positive states, totally stacked up, are greater than the negative state. So you've got the positive state set, then you set the negative state, and you do this only once. So you could say, can you remember the last time you accessed that negative state? And you anchor it in a different place than the positive state. Now the way you collapse anchors is you fire off both of them at the same time. And there's another picture on page 15 of the slide section, which shows you how to do collapse anchors. You look at that and notice that both fingers are on the anchor at the same time. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to fire the two of them at the same time and watch the integration occur. And usually, to me, the integration often shows an asymmetry. There's going to be an asymmetry going back and forth across the midline or rapid eye movement, or shift of the head going back and forth, or something. You'll see something shifting. In skin color, you'll see the skin tonus, the lower lip size, the pupil dilation, breathing. Any one of those, and many of those, may shift, and then it'll become steady. Once it becomes steady, then take your hand off the negative anchor for 5 seconds and hold on to the positive one, and then you're done. And that's really the big picture. By the way, we never stack the negative anchors for collapse anchors. We may stack a negative anchors in a chain of anchors for procrastination to motivation, for example. We may have to stack procrastination. But in a collapse anchors, we never stack the negative anchor. If you're removing more than one negative anchor, then you can keep the same place for the positive anchor, but you want to put the negative anchor in a different place. Now, what does this do? It gives the client new neurological choices. It doesn't take away the choice of being negative, but it integrates these particular feelings along with the negative ones and gives them new choices. Then to test it, we can have them go back and think about their negative state, and we notice what state they get into. Okay, let's look at page 48 now and get real specific here with the script that we've given you. The first thing you want to do is get into rapport with the client. And so for that, what I would suggest is that you match and or mirror the client. And then number 2, you tell the client what you're about to do. So you say to the client, in a moment, I'm going to do a process called collapse anchors, and you can explain what that means if you need to. And that will necessitate that I touch you. Is that okay? I think it's real important to say to a client, I'm going to touch you. In some circumstances, if you didn't tell the client you were going to touch him before you did, you could have a client jump out of his skin. So you really want to mention to the client, excuse me, Mr. Client, or Ms. Client, in just a moment I'm going to touch you, so please be aware that that's coming. Okay, number 3, you're going to decide on which resource states are needed, positive resource states are needed, and then decide on the negative state to be collapsed. I think before you actually do it, so this is collapse anchor design, I think before you actually do it, that you should be clear specifically which states are involved. And notice which powerful positive states are most useful for the client. And notice that there may be some negative states or positive states on this list. There may be some positive states which aren't useful. So in that case, if you say to the client, can you remember a time when you fell down laughing? And the client goes, yeah, I could. They don't have a falling down laughing reference experience, or maybe they don't laugh much. Well, that's okay. Don't use that one. Only use the ones that have some relationship to your client, or that your client really relates to in some way. Okay, number 4, as you elicit the powerful positive states, get into each one before you elicit it in the client. And then number 5, make sure the client is in a fully associated, intense, congruent state for each of the states you anchor. And then number 6, anchor all the positive states in the same place. That is the knuckle, as you've seen on page 15 of the slide section. You can actually see the anchor there. Anchor all the positive states in the same place. For example, a knuckle or another easily identifiable place. Okay, number 7, you're going to anchor the negative state once. Just anchor the negative state once. And then number 8, fire the anchors at the same time until they peak, and they should peak together. So they peak together, and the integration is complete. Watch the client, it says here. They will usually exhibit signs of asymmetry until the integration is complete. Not every client will exhibit asymmetry, but most will, so it's worth watching for. Number 9, you're going to release the negative anchor and continue to hold the positive anchor for 5 more seconds and then release that. And then number 11, you test, and you can say, now, how do you feel about that old state? And they'll tell you. They'll say, well, this or this or this. And then number 12, you say, can you imagine a time in the future when you might be in a similar situation? And tell me what happens. And you want to observe the client in the test and the future pace to make sure that they're not going back into that old state. Observe the client very carefully. Keep an eye on the client and make sure that the client is in a powerful positive state, or at very least, that the client is not in a negative state. Okay, so that's how you do a collapse anchors. And very simply, it's simply stack up a bunch of powerful positive states, collapse it with a negative state, and then fire them both at the same time, making sure that they integrate and that you leave your hand on the powerful positive states for a little bit longer, and then test in future pace. All right, let's go on to page 49 and talk for a moment about chaining anchors. And chaining anchors is used slightly differently from the way collapse anchors is used, because chaining anchors, whereas collapse anchors is simultaneous and you hold your hand on the knuckle, both fingers on the knuckle at the same time, a chaining anchor is going to go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. So a chaining anchors will go essentially 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. If you look at slide page number 11, slide number 62, what you'll notice is a diagram there where it talks about collapse anchors being simultaneous and a chaining of anchors being sequential. And I want to talk for a few moments about chain design and actually how do we design a chain, and then I want to get real specific about how to do a chain of anchors. I think big picture for chaining anchors is on slide number 63. You simply elicit all the states and anchor them, then you test them, then you chain 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. But before you do that, you actually want to go through and design the chain. So before you actually are going to set up that chain of anchors, you really need to design that whole chain of anchors so that the chain goes from 1 to 2 to 3, 4, and it meets certain criteria. And the criteria are on slide number 64, page 11. So let's talk about that for just a moment. So here's how to design a chain. And by the way, chain design is really important when it comes in NLP, when it comes to a number of different things. Chain design is important in doing a chain of anchors. It's also the same kind of thinking that we do when we do strategy installation and strategy design. So we're going to use chain design as an example and as a really basic example for beginning and looking at how do you actually do the entire process of designing a chain from beginning to end. Okay, slide number 64. The first thing to do is to decide the first state and the last state. What's the first state that the presenting problem essentially? For example, the example we used on slide number 63 is procrastination and then motivation. Now, the person comes in and they might say, well, I procrastinate or I don't get things done. Another good example for a chaining of anchors is stuck no options. I get stuck, I get grumpy, and I can't get out of that state. And I really feel like I have no options. Those are two really good examples of when you'd use a chaining anchors. Actually, that does bring up the question of when do you use a chain of anchors versus when do you collapse anchors? So let me talk about that for a moment. A chain of anchors is used when the present state is significantly different from the desired state. And that's the standard NLP of when you use chain anchors. But the fact is that in addition, there are some other criteria. And it seems to me, and I've only become aware of this recently, it seems to me that the chain of anchors is really necessary when a person is in a stuck, not moving or non-moving present state. The present state being really, really stuck requires a chain of anchors. So there are two major criteria then. You use a chain of anchors when the first state is a stuck state and when it's significantly different from the end state. Now here's the question, and I think this is really a good question. How would you like to be able to get out of any stuck state that you ever got into? How would you like to be able to work with clients and assist them in clearing up procrastination? You know, we did a procrastination and motivation with this one guy. We were doing business consulting, and we looked like we were magicians. I mean, he came in and he said, you know, I'm just the world's worst procrastinator. I just procrastinate terribly. And I wonder if you guys have anything in your business consulting that you can tell me that would help me with my procrastination. Well, we said, no, there's not much we can tell you, but we can certainly do some NLP that will get rid of it. And so we simply did a chain of anchors with him from procrastination to motivation. And I'll tell you what, the next day, his procrastination totally ended and it didn't recur. He thought we were geniuses. And the fact is, it's a very, very simple set of setting up and designing a chain that goes from procrastination to motivation. Or stuck no options. If you yourself or you know somebody who gets stuck and they don't move and they're not going anywhere and they get really into it, they get grumpy and then they get stuck in it, simply setting up a stuck no options to going for it is also a really good use of the set of chaining anchors. So again, there's too great a transition for a simple two-step process. The present state is so widely separated or removed from the desired state that it's not going to pull over easily or not going to collapse together real well. And then The present state should generally, for chaining anchors, the present state should generally be a stuck state. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And we're going to chain together certain experiences. And we're actually going to, wouldn't you think, we're actually going to install, it's almost like installing a new strategy for getting out of procrastination. Okay, so let's talk about how you design a chain. And I think these are the criteria for the intermediate states. We're still on slide number 64. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, does the next state need to be toward or away from? My question is to the client, when I'm trying to decide this, I'll ask the client about a second state. So I'll say to the client, here's a possible second state. Does that second state seem like it would be a good state? Does that state seem to you as though it would be sufficient to get you off of procrastination? Now the client's going to either say, yep, that'll get me off procrastination, or, whoa, that's a great state. I really like to get into that state. Yes, I can get off the procrastination. Now, let's say I give the client several toward states and he doesn't respond. So I say, well, let's see. So excitement, you're procrastinating. Would excitement get you off it? He goes, yeah, maybe. Or I would say, how about real intense desire? Would that get you off it? He goes, well, yeah, probably. Though that's not going to do it. So then you may need to look at some away from states. And what are some away from states that you could use? So you might say to the client, well, how about, excruciating boredom? And the client goes, oh, I don't like boredom. I'd do anything to avoid boredom. Then that's the state for the client. Excruciating boredom or confusion. Confusion's often good. Many people will do anything to avoid confusion. Those are some states which move away from. And the client themselves will move away from those states. If you get a state like that, then you may need to use that as a second state. Okay, the second thing is that the state should be of the same or a similar logical type. I think especially the state should be associated. So, for example, a client who says to you, let's see, what would get you off of procrastination? Well, I think I'd get off of procrastination if the Cubans attacked Florida. Hello? That's clearly not the same logical type as procrastination. So, and that is a left field example, but you have to evaluate, you have to think about it yourself and think about it. When the client gives you, and you're working with a client, you say to the client, well, what would be a really good next state? I think you've got to evaluate the state and look at it and go, hey, is this the same logical type? Is this the same sort of thing that we're talking about, and is it a state? Okay, next thing is the next state must have movement. And movement means it's a moving state. Let me give you some examples of some states that are not moving. One client said to me, real intense satisfaction. Well, real intense satisfaction to me doesn't move. I don't know about you. And here's the thing, as you listen to this program, why don't you just stop and try on some of these states as I talk about them? But think about a state of real intense satisfaction. Would that move you on to the next state? It certainly doesn't seem to have movement to me. Or another one. Here's another one. Real intense bliss. Oh, wow, I'm so blissed out. This is so cool. But do you have any movement when you get there? No, probably not. At least I don't when I try those states on. If you try a state on when you're designing a chain with a client, if you try the state on and it doesn't move you, then the state probably doesn't have movement. And you got to feel the state inside yourself. And if you're just not moved by that state, well, I'll tell you what, don't do it. That's not going to be the state. So pick another state. Okay. Next thing is, what's a sufficiently intense state to move the chain on to the next state? Now let's see what that means. Well, there are intense states, and I think states like, wanton desire or intense excitement, those are intense states. A state that doesn't have much intensity to me, one client one time said to me, well, I think, I would get off of procrastination if I really had some interest in something. And I went, interest? Like, haven't you been interested before in things and not gotten off of procrastination? He goes, well, yeah. Well, see, interest to me, what's the difference between interest and moving it into wanton desire? So the key is the intensity of the state. If you try on the state when you're designing the chain, if you try on the state and that state doesn't have sufficient intensity, if it's not a lot of juice, if when you try it on, inside yourself, you don't go, whoa, then it's probably not intense enough. So pick a different state. Now, some chains of anchors are going to have 5 states. The diagram here on page 63 slide 63 has 4 states. And some chains of anchors can be as little as 3 states. A chain of anchors, by definition, wouldn't have 2 states because that would be similar to a collapse anchors. And I think a chain of anchors probably shouldn't have more than 5 states. In other words, shouldn't have 6 or more. But it should be limited to 4 or 5 states. I think a chain of anchors with more than 5 states probably won't pull through adequately. So you've got to be very careful about not having that chain get too big. But the second to last state, so in a 4-step chain, the second to last state would be the 3rd state. And the 4th state, of course, would be motivation if you're doing procrastination and motivation. In a 5-step chain, the second to last state would be the 4th step. Those should be a toward state. Now let me define toward and away from if I haven't defined them clearly yet. Toward means you're moving toward what you want, and away from means you're moving away from what you don't want. I gave you some examples earlier at the beginning, as we began to talk about slide 64. I gave you some examples earlier. But in a toward state, you move toward what you want. That might be things like want and desire, or excitement, or passion, getting passionate about something. Away from states include boredom, frustration, things that you would avoid, or confusion, things that you would avoid and not want to, get into. And I think in the second to last state, the one just before motivation, if you're doing procrastination and motivation, should be toward. Okay, the state should be self-initiated. Now, what does that mean? What does self-initiated mean? Well, self-initiated means that it should be inside the client, determined inside the client. If the state is determined inside the client, then it's going to be something that the client has control of. The problem with a state that's not self-initiated is that they probably don't, if it's not self-initiated and it doesn't happen outside themselves, then it probably won't happen. Here, let me give you an example. I had one client say to me, I think a really good state would be shame at not getting the project done. Well, think about that for just a minute. Shame at not getting the project done. Hello. The guy or the person here, that's going to require someone outside themselves. I said to him, you wouldn't be ashamed if there wasn't anybody else around you, would you? And he said, well, no, probably not. So the state itself needs to be self-initiated, which means that they themselves will produce this state inside themselves, regardless of what else is going on outside them. Okay? And then finally, the state should not be how they already do it. So one client said to me, what's going to get me off of procrastination is looming deadlines. And I went, looming deadlines? Don't you already have looming deadlines? Well, he said, yes, I do. And I said, isn't procrastination already a problem? Well, yes, it is. Well, then the looming deadlines right now don't get you off of procrastination. How are they going to get you off of procrastination if I install them as a chain or install them in the chain? And he said, well, of course they're not. So the state itself should not be how the client already does it. So those are some considerations for chain design. Those are the kinds of things which you could be thinking about in designing a chain of anchors, assuming you're going to do one with someone. And we'll get a chance, by the way, to do a chain of anchors at the practitioner training when you come to it. We'll get a chance to go through it. I'll repeat the notion about chain design. We'll talk a little bit about it, and we'll go through some extra states because I've not mentioned all the states that we could possibly use for toward versus away from, and we'll get the class's idea at the same time as to what they would like, as to what each of you would use to get rid of a particular state. All right, so chaining anchors. Let's go to page 49 now and look specifically at the process. And the first thing we want to do, turn to page 49, the first thing we want to do is we want to get into rapport. I think that's always important, especially in eliciting a state. And remember, you're going to hopefully get into the state before you elicit it. Now, here's a state that I wouldn't get into before I elicit it, and that's procrastination. One of the things I've noticed, it's kind of funny, one of the things I've noticed is that sometimes The students will get into the state, and the practitioner will get into the state, and the client will get into the state, and then we'll have a whole group of people in a state of procrastination while they're trying to work out a chain. So I think it's probably best to stay out of the state of procrastination if you're doing procrastination to motivation for the chain of anchors. Okay, so the first step, get into rapport. Second step, tell the client what you're about to do. And you say, in just a moment, I'm going to do a process called chaining anchors. You can explain that if you want to. And that will necessitate that I touch you on the knuckle. Is that okay? Yes, good. Number 3, identify the undesirable present state. That is procrastination. And decide on the positive resource end state, which in this case would be motivation. Those are just 2 examples. You could use other states. As I mentioned, stuck no options to going for it's a good state. And actually any stuck state, and then you could decide what the client wanted to end up in. And I think you want to do this with the client. Have the client's ideas on it, but make sure that you test these out. Make sure that you test them out fully in your own awareness and in your own experience so that you can be sure that these are the states that are good for the client or that are the right states. Okay, number 4, you're going to design the chain and decide on what intermediate states are necessary to lead to the end state. And we've talked about chain design. Number 5, we're going to elicit and anchor each state separately. So in our little diagram here, we anchor present state, which is state number 1. We anchor the intermediate state, which is state number 2. We anchor the next intermediate state, which is state number 3. We anchor the next intermediate state, which is state number 4. Just for argument's sake, let's say that we decided that the present state was procrastination and the next state was going to be confusion. Because when we talked to the client, he said, oh, God, I hate confusion. I would do anything to not be in confusion. And then the next state would be want and desire. And the final state would be motivation. So present state, procrastination. Second state is confusion. Third state's the intermediate state is want and desire. And the fourth state is motivation. So we're going to anchor each one of those separately. And it says here in the notes, you may have to stack all states to get a high intensity. Sometimes the state of procrastination is a rather dissociated state for some people. If you find that procrastination is a dissociated state for your client, then you will have to stack that as an anchor. One of the things that if a chain doesn't pull through, one of the things I've noticed is that oftentimes the state of procrastination wasn't stacked highly enough. It wasn't intense enough. And I think also it says here, make sure the subject is out of the previous state prior to anchoring the next one. And we're going to break state between states, especially between the last one when we anchor the motivation and the first one when we come around again and test the procrastination. Okay, number 6, we're going to test each state separately. Test each state separately and make sure that the client goes into each state. Then we're going to chain each state together by firing number 1, and when number 1 is at its peak, we add number 2, and then we release number 1 at the same time. Let me talk about that for just a moment. If I fire anchor number 1, and anchor number 1 comes up to its peak, when I see number 1 hitting its peak, I then put my finger on number 2, taking my finger off number 1 almost at the same time. Both fingers are touching at the same time, but number 1 comes off almost immediately upon number 2 going on. What that does is it's not a collapse anchors because both states don't reach their peak at the same time. If both states reach their peak at the same time, it would be a collapse anchors. But since both states don't reach their peak at the same time, it's definitely not a collapse anchors. Okay, so then number 2 comes up to its peak, and we add number 3 and release number 2, and then we add number 4 in the same way. And it says here this is not a collapse because the 2 states do not peak at the same time. Okay, number 8, we're going to test. We're going to fire the present state anchor, and the client's going to end up in the final state. Once we've got them chained together, we test by just simply firing anchor number 1. What we should see, if the client does it quickly, we should see the client just bang, end up in motivation. If the client doesn't do it quickly, if they do it rather slowly, what we could see is we could see the client go into procrastination, then we could see them get confused, then we could see the desire, want and desire, and then we could see them end up in motivation. We could see either one of those, but the client should end up in the final state. Then you're going to ask the client, so how do you feel about procrastination now? How do you feel about procrastination? The client says, wow, I feel motivated. And actually, when you ask them, you should see them actually go right into the motivated state. It's kind of fun. Chaining anchors is a great process. In fact, chaining anchors is such a great process. It's probably one of the processes that I would use instead of timeline therapy for procrastination. In other words, if somebody came to me and they said, I procrastinate, chaining anchors would be my first choice for intervention. Okay, number 10, can you think of a time in the future which if it had happened in the past, you would have procrastinated, and tell me what happens instead? That's the future pace. And then the client is essentially installing a recovery strategy or future strategies in the client's future, which is really a good thing to do. Okay, so that's chaining anchors. And we've taken a look at the process of chaining anchors and how to chain anchors. We'll get a chance to do this fully in the practitioner training when you come and take it. If you want to practice it on your own, by all means, go ahead. Please go right ahead and practice that. And if you need any help, simply call the office at 1-800-800-MIND if you want to talk to someone about that. They'll give you some tips and pointers if you need more assistance. All right, let's look at a couple of other processes that used anchoring, which we no longer do, and I'll tell you why we don't. Although the New Orleans flexibility drill is a pretty good process, if you look at page 50, it's not used much anymore, and I've simply included it for historical reasons. Usually, the process isn't used so much anymore because we've replaced it with the timeline therapy techniques. But in the New Orleans flexibility drill, what used to happen was the client would identify an external stimulus, which would be a person, a place, or a thing, or a specific syntax of internal and external processes involving any or all of those, that constantly trigger an unresourceful state in the client. Then the practitioner anchors the client in several unresourceful states, accessing the appropriate resources to successfully handle the situation. And then they use the same anchor for each of these resource states. In other words, stacking the anchors. And the practitioner creates for the client a powerful, positive stacked anchor. And then the practitioner tests the anchor. Then the client provides a detailed description of the scenario identified as step number 1 and coaches the observer in the specific behaviors necessary to role play so as to totally and accurately reproduce the external stimulus. And that means using verbal and nonverbal language patterns to create and recreate the external stimulus, which may include the recreation of situations devoid of human interaction. Let me give you an example, because this is a little dry sort of a description. Let me give you an example. One of the ways I've used it is with a fellow that couldn't approach girls. He couldn't get a date with a girl, so he was afraid to walk up to them. So what you do is you simply put him in a situation where he might have to do that and fire off those positive anchors. And what happens is it's almost in a sense of role playing. And then you could actually, number 4, the practitioner triggers the client's stacked resources as the observer begins to role play the external stimulus. The observer continues to role play. Practitioner intermittently releases the client's anchor, calibrating the client. And if the client begins to revert to an unresourceful state, the practitioner fires the anchor again. And then you continue until there's no longer any need for the practitioner to externally anchor the client. And that is, the client stays totally resourceful. And then what happens now is that the external stimulus that previously triggered an unresourceful response in the client now triggers a resourceful response related to the resources provided by the stacked anchor in number 2. Okay, that's the New Orleans flexibility drill. As I mentioned before, it's not used much, and we include it here only for historical purposes. In addition, I want to call your attention to the NLP Change Personal History. We have an outline of that on page 51, and we're not going to cover that, but if you wanted to, you could read that over. That's also been essentially replaced by timeline therapy. Let's talk about the physiology of excellence. And I think in our last remaining minutes on this program, we might just do this together if we have a chance. So let's do it together. Let's look at it first. The theory is that we can adopt through the process of modeling, and we talk about modeling in the Master Practitioner Training, that we can adopt any excellent behavior in ourselves and others and utilize that excellent behavior to produce the kind of results we want to produce. The theory is that anything you can do, I can elicit it, and I can do it also through the process of modeling. You can find and model excellent behavior and install it in someone else. The ring of power is a useful way to actually install some sort of internal behavior or internal state with a person. In successful people, we often observe that they're generally in control of their state no matter what the external circumstances are, and that they have a most excellent way of staying in a positive, uptime, positive state. So the process is going to be essentially to anchor a number of positive states to an imagined circle on the floor. Imagine a ring of power in front of you as a circle that says here about 2 feet in diameter. Now remember a time when you were totally motivated, and when you're totally motivated, then step into the ring. When the state begins to subside, then step out of the ring. And we can add additional states that way. And it says here, of course, for additional states, just go ahead and look at page 47. So let's do this together. If you want to, this is kind of fun. And I think I can talk you through this. And if need be, and if the tape finishes up before we're done, then you can simply go ahead and add the additional states in that way. So let's do this together. If you would please stop. And why don't you go ahead and stand up? All right. Just go ahead and stand right up there. And pick a place to stand where you've got a couple of feet in front of you. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to imagine a ring of power in front of you. We're going to call it a ring of power as a circle about 2 feet in diameter right there in front of you. Got that? You could imagine it. What I do is when I do it, I imagine it glowing brightly like a flame, glowing brightly like a flame of fire in 2 foot ring or circle right in front of me. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is remember a time when you were totally motivated. Go back to that time now. Remember a time when you were totally motivated. Remember a specific time. Go right back to that time, float down into your body and see what you saw, hear what you heard, and feel the feelings of being totally motivated. And when you've got that, go ahead and step right into that ring of power. Step right into it. Okay, good. Now, when you feel the feeling of being totally motivated, when you feel the feeling subside, then make sure you step out of that circle just as soon as you feel that subside. Okay? The next state we're going to do is a time when you felt totally powerful. So can you remember a time, if you would please, remember a time when you felt totally powerful, totally powerful, totally powerful. And step right into that state, step in it, see what you saw, hear what you heard, feel the feelings of being totally powerful. And when you got that, step right into your ring. Just go ahead and step right into the ring. Standing like you would stand if you were totally powerful. Breathing like you'd breathe if you're totally powerful. Good. Good, okay, and when it subsides, just go ahead and step right out of the ring. Step right out of the ring. That's good. Very good. Okay, now, how about a time when you felt totally loved? How about a time when you felt totally loved? Yeah. Okay, just go ahead and step right into that ring. Just go ahead and step right into the ring of power. There you go. Feeling the feelings of being totally loved. Very good. And again, when the state subsides, step out of the ring. Good. Now, a time when you felt you could have whatever you wanted, a time when you could have it all, a time when you could have anything you wanted. That's right. Go back to that time now, float down into your body, see what you saw, hear what you heard, and really feel the feelings of being able to have it all, and go ahead and step into the ring. Good. When the state subsides, go ahead and step out of the ring. Now, how about a time when you felt really energetic? Really, when you had a ton of energy. You were just bursting with energy. You could feel energetic all over. Good. All over. Go back to that time, float down into your body, see what you saw, hear what you heard, and really feel the feelings of being totally energetic. And step right into your body. When you got that, just go ahead and step right into the ring. Good. Good. When the state subsides, step out of the ring. Good. Now, how about a time when you fell down laughing? How about a time when you fell down laughing? You got it? Okay, just go ahead whenever you got it, float down into your body, see what you saw, hear what you heard, feel the feelings of totally falling down laughing, and step right into the ring. Okay, good. All right, good. Okay, I got to get out of that state. Okay, good. All right. Okay, welcome back. How about a time now when you felt totally confident? You felt totally confident. A time when you felt totally confident. All right, just go ahead and step right into the circle. Step right into the circle. A time when you felt totally confident. Go back to the time, float down into your body, see what you saw, hear what you heard, and really feel the feelings of being totally, totally confident. Good. Very good. Very good. Okay, now step out of the ring. Now what we're going to do is we're going to test. We're going to test this. So theoretically now we've got a series of states stacked right up. If you want to add some more states, you can stop the program right here. Just press pause and then go ahead and add the other states. And if you've done that, now just go ahead and step right into the ring of power and we're going to test it. Just go ahead and imagine the ring in front of you, 2 feet in diameter, and just go ahead and test it. Step right into it. Good. And when you're ready, just go ahead and step right back out. That's good. Now the ring of power, actually notice it on the floor in front of you. Now what you can do is just take it and shrink it down and put it on one of your fingers. Just take it and shrink it right down and put it right on one of your fingers. And you can leave it there as an anchor, which you can access anytime in the future. All you have to do is simply take it off your finger, put it down on the ground, make it 2 feet in diameter once again, and step right into it. That's kind of fun, huh? So that's our ring of power, and that sort of concludes our section on anchoring. And this concludes the 9th program in our series, the Accelerated NLP Training Series. We'll do more on anchoring when you come to the practitioner training and join us. We're going to move into strategies next, so come back and join us for program number 10.